Have you heard of Poetry Teatime but are at a complete loss as to what it is and how it can help your homeschool? Stay tuned, because I'm hoping to be able to answer all the questions you have about poetry and tea. So the first question usually is, what is Poetry Teatime? Poetry Teatime is a time you set aside about once a week where you and your kids can relax, enjoy poetry, and enjoy a tasty drink and treat. There is a beautiful Instagram account. It's called @PoetryTeatime. I'll link to it below. It's really beautiful and it's a great place to go if you want some inspiration, but really Poetry Teatime doesn't have to be anything Instagram worthy. The main focus here is that everyone enjoys themselves. This is a time to connect poetry with enjoyment. Now the next question you may be asking is, why should I do Poetry Teatime? I think we've all in our lives heard someone say, poetry's boring, and maybe even you're someone who thinks this way. Poetry does not have to be a source of stress or unease for anyone. The point of Poetry Teatime is to spend some nice, relaxing quality time together as a family in which you can enjoy the poetry of your choice, of your kid's choice, however you guys want to do it. Also while just enjoying tea, which is extremely soothing. If you're still interested in doing a Poetry Teatime with you and your family and I haven't lost you yet, you may be wondering to yourself, how would I do Poetry Teatime? Poetry Teatime probably looks differently for every family. Like I said before, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. However, if you're one of these people who loves to bake those really beautiful little pastries or treats, or you love to decorate with fancy china or a nice tablecloth, then go for it. How I start Poetry Teatime is by offering to make the kids tea, which they usually go wild for, and I offer to make their favorites so that they can choose which one they want. Once the tea is made, we sit down at the table and just read poetry from the various volumes I have. The ones that I personally have used are, I have a volume called 101 Great American Poems, so that's really interesting if you're interested in particularly American poetry. I also have Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, and then there's also just nursery rhymes by Mother Goose, which everyone knows. We have some favorite poems that we do like to revisit every time we do Poetry Teatime, but I do make a point of introducing new poems every single time. I encourage you to take note of which poems your children gravitate to. It might surprise you which ones are their favorites. For example, my children really love this modern American poet called William Carlos Williams. He writes this really modern poetry that does not rhyme, and his poems are all very, very short. And if you would have asked me ahead of time, hey Jenny, do you think your kids are gonna like these modern, non-rhyming short poems? I would have said, no way, that's boring to a kid. But they love it because they paint such a vivid picture of what the poet is trying to describe. So my point here is really don't rule out anything. Julie Bogart, who is the author of Poetry Teatime Companion, and she also created the Brave Writer curriculum, said that she actually started introducing Poetry Teatimes as a way to read Shakespeare and expose her children to Shakespeare in an enjoyable environment. I think that idea is brilliant, and I suggest, doing Shakespeare with your kids during Poetry Teatime, because Shakespeare is essentially long-form poetry. During Poetry Teatime, your kids can also practice memorization and recitation. This is kind of a process that you can work with on them through just a lot of repetition, but my kids really enjoy that, so they look forward to that whole process every time. Really, with Poetry Teatime, the options are endless. You can really do anything you want with it. I like to just leave this time of our day very student-led. Now, I've heard a lot of homeschoolers feel a little nervous about poetry because the parents themselves feel like they don't know a ton of poetry. What I have to say about that is that there is no shame in learning alongside your kids. What I would suggest doing is borrowing various poetry books from the library to just kind of see what you and your children really gravitate towards before you spend any of your money on any sort of poetry books. I also want to make a podcast suggestion here. I know this isn't a podcast video, but I've really been enjoying The Well-Read Poem. And this is a podcast in which the host, Thomas Banks, reads a poem and then He breaks down kind of what the poem is about, and he remarks on anything that's noteworthy about the way that the poem is written, and then he reads the poem again so that you can digest it and really understand what the poet was trying to say. This is a podcast that kids and adults can all enjoy together. Now, you may be on board with Poetry Tea Time and the whole poetry aspect of things, but I know for us Americans, we might be wondering, what if I don't know anything about tea? I mean, in all seriousness, in the United States, tea just simply isn't a big part of our life like it is in other countries. So here are just a few small tips that I have about tea. I'm not a tea expert, but after making tea for my kids, I've learned a few things. One of our favorite teas is called Sleepy Time Tea. It's by Celestial Seasonings. It comes in all sorts of flavors, and it's never caffeinated, so you never have to worry about that. And it's a very sweet tea, and it's supposed to be very calming, so that might be something that you are looking for in a tea for your kids. Our other favorite is Throat Coat by Traditional Medicinals. This tea is a tea that I just started drinking for sore throats, but I found that it's actually very, very sweet, and so my kids love it, and it also does not have caffeine. Whatever you do when it comes to tea for kids, make sure it does not have caffeine, and also I would suggest not adding any added sweetener if you don't have to. If there's something about a certain tea you're drinking that you just don't like, go ahead and try another kind of tea. It doesn't hurt to give a new one a try. Before I start wrapping this up, I want to give a few more tips and notes that I have about Poetry Tea Time. There are a few books on the subject, like the one I mentioned before by Julie Bogart called A Poetry Tea Time Companion. There's also another book called A Year of Poetry Tea Time by Christine Owens. I will link both in the description below. They are both a wealth of knowledge on how to do Poetry Tea Time and everything that goes along with it. I also want to mention that you shouldn't be afraid to try to expand your Poetry Tea Time by inviting some friends. Have younger siblings and younger family members participate. Have extended family members come over for Poetry Tea Time. I've even been hosting a virtual tea time with a bunch of my nieces and nephews. I think it's 7 kids in total, in which we all share original poetry and poetry we read recently. So it's really fun. The more the merrier. The thing I want to leave you with about Poetry Tea Time is the point is enjoyment. Try not to stress about this time that you're spending with your kids. The point is to relax and just go with the flow. If your kids are learning to enjoy poetry right now while they're young, they will continue to have an appreciation for it forevermore. How do you plan to do Poetry Tea Time in your homeschool? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to see more videos just like this one. See you next time!